Steven, welcome to the podcast. It is so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Very excited to talk about the Guncle, which has come out recently. If ever there was a cover that screamed, "Read me during the summer," this one would so be it, around the pool and the palm tree and everything.
I know on a recording you can't always see, yeah, but it is a big ray of yellow sunshine, this book cover, and I couldn't be happier.
Please tell everyone what they will find when they pick up the Guncle.
Well, yeah, I've been doing press for this book, and I always start with, well, in case any of your listeners don't know what a guncle is, but I don't think we need to start that basic. But, I've long had a fascination with Auntie Mame, first the Patrick Dennis novel, and then a Broadway play and a movie with Rosalind Russell, and then a Broadway musical with Angela Lansbury, and then a movie musical with a slightly miscast Lucille Ball. But it sort of got me thinking, we're time for a modern day retelling of this. And Patrick Dennis, who created the character, was married and had children, but came out later in his life. He died relatively young, but, was active in the gay scene in Greenwich Village in the late 60s and early 70s, and, was at least bisexual. And it got me thinking about, sort of writers from the mid-century, Tennessee Williams, who sort of created these larger than life women. And is that maybe perhaps because they were sort of stand-ins for not being able to openly write about gay men? And so now that times have changed, I thought, oh, well, let's put a gay man in the heart of Auntie Mame, where perhaps maybe that's where he was intended to be.
That makes total sense. I mean, because there is so much of the Auntie Mame vibe here, some of the adventures they get up to, but also much like that story did, there's also some more heavier issues inside this. Everybody's got a little bit of loss that they're dealing with and coming back from that.
Yeah. So Patrick O'Hara is the main character, the title Guncle, and he is a sort of former television star who's retired to Palm Springs and is sort of nursing his wounds after losing his boyfriend years earlier in an automobile crash. And when fresh tragedy strikes, and he's tasked with taking in his niece and nephew for the summer. And in doing so, that sort of brings about a season of healing for all three of them. But you're right. I set out to write a light comedic novel. I thought, they were sort of in fashion in the 50s and 60s, and I loved the idea of it. But Mame sent her ward off to boarding school in a way, and sort of sidestep having to deal with the grief. And I very much did not want to do that. And coincidentally, I lost a best friend of mine from college to breast cancer early on in the writing process, and she left behind a 6-year-old son. So it made me think very deeply about grief in children and about what roles her sort of larger friend community had or could fill in reminding this child how much he was loved, because how much would a 6-year-old maybe remember of his mother as he grew older? So, I started thinking about these issues in a much more serious way. I do think the book is still very funny. I think it's outright the funniest book I've written, but it's also a deep exploration of grief. But it doesn't take a gay person to tell you that comedy and tragedy are two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. And that's kind of time and again what is in this book. It's like funny, and sometimes it's the funny that trips back into the grief of what these characters have lost. I'm curious from your writing perspective, based on what you just said, that some of these things came as you were writing it. So from that end, did you go into this thinking, here's my plot for this book and I'm going to do this? Or are you more of the discovery writer to see how things pan out as you go?
Yeah, I'm more of the discovery writer. I mean, I had a general sort of sense of what, and this isn't obviously like, there's been Mary Poppins, there's Maria from The Sound of Music, there's John Candy's Uncle Buck. There's a genre of this story. So it's in the execution and executing it in a new way. And that's where I wanted to leave room for surprise, because I really wanted this to have a fresh voice. It's not just an uncle inheriting his children, it's a guncle. So what from the queer experience could he offer as his sort of superpower? And so the book is infused with the, pop cultural references, the humor, the empathy, the politics, the sort of worldview that are informed by my life experience as an out gay man, sort of all worked its way into this book. And I don't have kids. So it was an interesting exercise to think about what I might have to offer, on the subject of child rearing. And that's where there were, a lot of surprises. And Some of the humor comes from Patrick not necessarily knowing how to communicate with children. And yes, that can be funny and there can be miscommunication, but also it's kind of his hidden strength in that he treats them like small adults, and children can handle oftentimes much more than we give them credit for, particularly on very serious subjects where they don't want to be handled with kid gloves. They don't want things sugar-coated for them, and they're certainly not from Patrick.
Which I agree is his superpower, because he's not going to hide stuff from them that they kind of need to know. He might
Right.
sugarcoat it a little bit, but they're still going to know the situation in the long run.
Yeah.
Have you played a Guncle role before? You don't have kids of your own, but do you have children in your life that you play that role to?
Well, yeah, I'm the Guncle to 5, 3 nephews and 2 nieces, and I do live in Palm Springs, California. So that's one thing I have in common with Patrick. But our senses of humor probably overlap, and some of our references. But Patrick's sort of a sadder clown than I am. I will say though that one thing about being a Guncle is, my nieces and nephews are all in the Northeast, and I live out here in California, and I have a swimming pool and there are palm trees, and I don't go to an office like they see most adults do. I don't think they have quite figured out my life. I seem like a bit of an oddity, a bit outside of the step of life. So I guess that they might view me with some of the same skepticism as the kids view Patrick.
Now, while you haven't had to have them with you for that long, are there any particular scenes in the book where it's like something you've done with one of your 5 nieces and nephews that kind of worked its way into the book as one of the many things and adventures they kind of go on?
Well, yeah, I don't know, exactly. They've certainly come to visit me here in Palm Springs. Certainly some of the, we must inflate every pool float so that you can't see even an inch of blue water surface on the pool. Some of the details like that are absolutely from real life. But it's more sort of like the emotional feeling of, Patrick feeling overwhelmed, the relentless questions that kids ask, the endless why. And then again, it's not necessarily original. We've seen, from Diane Keaton and Baby Boom to, all sorts of examples of people being tasked with caring for children and feeling out of their league. Patrick's still a gay man. He's very capable. I don't want the if it were a straight man, I can't make pancakes, and oh no, there's syrup on the ceiling because it turned into such a disaster. No, Patrick's a more capable character than a hapless, say, straight man. But, I wanted to sort of play up the exasperation of constantly being needled by kids when he's used to having the spotlight a little bit.
And needled at all hours, too. Well, there are so many great fish out of water elements in the story, especially in the beginning, as everybody kind of gets used to being around each other. I adored the entire thing with the toilet, this smart toilet that the kids don't understand. In the middle of the night, the lid comes up and the lights come on. How did you kind of pick and choose the various situations that these kids and Patrick were going to deal with?
That was me sidestepping an issue, which was that kids do love bathroom humor. I always think bathroom humor is kind of cheap, that there's a better way, there's a better laugh to be had. So instead I was like, well, what if the actual toilet were a $20,000 Japanese washlet, which is the pride of Patrick's, that there could be humor that stems from that. Again, it's like, as you mentioned, the fish out of water thing. They've never seen a $20,000 toilet with ionized light and maybe speakers and jets that spray every which way. So that was really fun to write. Everyone asks if I do not have this $20,000 toilet, but just having researched it online, that the internet now thinks I'm a toilet fetishist because all of my sponsored ads are for very expensive porcelain bowls.
The things I can do to the algorithms.
Yeah, that's the least of my problems. I worry about, thriller writers, and if the NSA are listening in or whatever.
Right. The other thing that you did so well, and we talked about this a little bit, was just really finding that balance between that humor and some of the grief and the things that all these characters are going through. How did you go through, as I'm guessing this was through revisions, to find that balance to just make it all connect together as perfectly as it does?
Yeah, that's the real challenge, right? Hopefully the book's strength is that it gets that balance right, but that is the biggest challenge, because sometimes I get off on a comedic riff and I'm enjoying writing and in that sort of tone or voice, and I realize that, it's gone on too far, or we haven't addressed the serious issues. Grief isn't something that we always wear on our sleeve. It would be very easy for children to write a scene of children sobbing in the corner. That's the easy way to do it. But grief sort of seeps into the fabric of who we are, and it's something we live with for a very long time. So that there can be long stretches where it doesn't appear outwardly that someone is miserable or really distraught. And sometimes humor comes from that. It is a coping mechanism. It is a way that we pull ourselves through. And certainly, in those instances, humor is necessary. Humor is life. And there are, other times where humor just comes from situation, from these characters interacting with each other. As you said, the fish out of water elements, which are, sort of irresistible and fun to write. But it's interesting writing humor for a novel because, I could type something and think, this is going to get such a big laugh. And then I realize that it could be 3 years before anybody reads it because of the length of time it takes to write a novel and then get it into bookstores. So there has to be the longest lead time between punchline and laughter. It's always a challenge, and finding the right humor, because you do hope that your book has a shelf life. So you want people not to just read it this summer, but to hopefully find it in 5 years and 10 years and beyond. And so the humor has to really come from an honest place and from character more than anything topical.
Because certainly that with the pop culture references too, you don't want them to date too quickly.
Right. So all of the pop cultural references are already dated. That's how you fix that. Yeah. But that's not uncommon, right? So like gay men, we can often celebrate actresses of the past, or a lot of times it's because they don't make these types of movies anymore. So, some of our things that we worship culturally are just happen to be older already.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good perspective on that. We love romance on this podcast, obviously, because we're primarily romance driven. And there is the sweetest little romance starting to rebud for Patrick in the middle of all this. How he finds time for that with these precocious kids, I don't know, although they kind of help push him towards it sometimes.
Yeah.
What made that into an imperative piece of the story for you to tell for him?
Now, that's a prime example of where I surprised myself a little bit when writing that, because I didn't think there would be room for that in this story. That focusing on the central sort of, Patrick and the kids was really all there was going to be room for. But, if it is about people who are grieving and finding their way back towards the light, that opening oneself to the possibility of love again is certainly the biggest way to open yourself up. So that sort of surprised me by finding a way in the story. And there's a very dreamy character I named Emery. I adore him. I think he's a dreamboat. I'm not going to spoil whether say they end up together or not. He's not exactly right for Patrick, but I think this is where there's a line. He's not exactly right, but he's not necessarily wrong either. And it's sort of Patrick figuring this out, whether he's preemptively closing himself off to this or, for reasons other than he should.
And I found it at least to be a nice counterbalance to always kind of dealing with the kids, because then there's this kind of other more adult thing happening for Patrick too, in the middle of all this other stuff.
Right. Well, and it gives him an opportunity to deal with, any internalized homophobia he may have. Like, is it weird to show him as a romantic being or, in front of the kids? And, it's an opportunity for me to say, kids get it. I've certainly brought my husband home to meet my nieces and nephews, and it's like, oh, you're with him? Okay, great. Like they have it. That's all they need to know. It's us who make it a bigger deal sometimes than it needs to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Us pesky adults. Amongst all this humor and everything, did you have a favorite scene within this to write?
Oh, goodness. There's a big Christmas party at the heart of the story, even though it takes place over the summer. There's a little Christmas in July. And that was the sort of first moment of healing, I think, where it's a real sort of pivotal moment in this book. But it was an opportunity to write this big, boisterous, happy scene. And it's a sort of homage to May. We need a little Christmas right this very minute. But also, setting the whole story in Palm Springs, where you have these characters feeling very bleak, very dark, very, they're grieving. And then to place it in a place that is just filled with relentless sunshine. Everything is just clean with the sun in Palm Springs, and to explore that dichotomy. But that was fun to write a little bit of Christmas in the summer amidst the relentless heat and also their sort of gloomy moods, but then seeing the cobwebs pushed away. Now I'm mixing in some Annie. Look, I'm mixing my theater references here.
That's okay. You're allowed to mix those because they're all wonderful. Yeah, the Christmas scene. I love Christmas. First of all, I'll
Yeah,
watch
so do
a
I.
Christmas movie any time of the year. Maybe read a story any time of year, and to see that be their lifting, but also the reactions like, "There's a Christmas tree in your house," almost as if he wouldn't
Yeah.
know it was there.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the Christmas tree be pink also and tinsel in that sort of mid-century wonderful Palm Springs way. There may be familiar anchor points for the children, but even those will be different or interpreted in a new way.
Now, you narrated your own audiobook for this for the first
I
time.
did. Yeah.
How did that feel, getting to interpret your words in that way?
It was a really interesting exercise. Writing a book, I mentioned, it's a solitary occupation, and the words exist in your mind and your mind alone for so long until we get to, this week where it's finally out in the world. But they're yours and exclusively yours for such a long time that it's weird to hear someone else interpret them. And obviously, I have no control over the way a reader reads the book. They may go up when I go down, or in my head, or whatnot. But it was an interesting opportunity to, okay, I can put out in the world my interpretation of the material. For the record, if anyone is interested, they can buy the audiobook and see how it sort of exists in my head. But I'm also very happy to have other people put their spin on it. And Michael Urie, who's a wonderful actor, has narrated my first two audiobooks, my first two novels. And I have loved working with him. He's such a gentleman. And, we've had conversations about the books before he goes in to record. But it's not always how I hear it in my head, but it shouldn't be. That's his job. An actor should put their interpretation on something. So yeah, I don't know if one's better than the other or not. We'll see. Hopefully this wasn't a huge mistake.
What kind of prep did you do? Because I've talked to various audiobook narrators for the show, and I've had some of my own works converted to audio. And there's always that moment of, the prep that they're doing to find the characters and decide how everybody's voice is going to be. What was the process for you to be, Patrick sounds like this and the kids sound like this, and this is how all of this will kind of come together?
Yeah, well, Patrick was going to sound like me because that's just easiest. That's the bulk of the book. And also, by the way, he's the character closest to me also. So, that was not a stretch. Grant, the young boy, has a lisp in the book. And writing it, I wanted to thread just enough of the lisp in there so that the reader would hear it. But I didn't need to punch every single word. That would slow down the reading process. And again, it was interesting exercise then as a performer. How much of that do you perform to where it's cute and it distinguishes his voice from anyone else speaking, but also doesn't become annoying. So, I did work with a great director, and thankfully that is not something I didn't go into a closet and throw some sheets on the wall and record it in a vacuum. I was in a studio, and there was a sound engineer and a director and a great crew that really helped it happen. I also auditioned to do it. I'm not sure the publisher thought that necessarily the author should be the one to do it, but the whole thing was really fascinating.
Do you see yourself returning to the booth for either more of your books or even going off on an audiobook narrating career?
I'm not going to give up writing for that. I think an interesting challenge would be to read someone else's. I don't know. We'll see what books I write in the future. I just felt like this was an easy, natural extension, this book, of my natural voice. So in some ways, it made the most sense out of any of the books I've written. But, I don't know that the next book I'll be right for either. I don't know. We'll take it a case-by-case basis.
Now, your previous novels, The Editor and Lily and the Octopus, are both optioned to become movies. Mm-hmm. This seems like such an ideal one for a great, big, splashy movie. Anything you can maybe share around that?
I don't have any news that I am allowed to share yet, but you just hear the smile in my voice, and I'm very excited about the possibility for this, and hopefully something that I'm allowed to talk about very soon. But the other two are indeed making their way to the big screen. COVID slowed things down a little bit, but they're both picking up steam now. I did write the adaptation of The Editor, which was a fun, interesting process. More so than narrating the audiobook, at least reading the audiobook, I'm allowed to keep the entire text. When you adapt a book for the screen, and particularly a book like The Editor that's written in the first person, it's very internal. A lot takes place inside this character's head, and finding ways to translate that into dialogue and action and things you can see on the screen. That's always a challenge. You have to tear apart your own book and learn how to put it back together in a more visual way. I left that to another writer to do for Lily and the Octopus, just because that was a very autobiographical book. And I don't know, I feel like I appreciate that I had my say in the novel, and now it was time to let someone else interpret that I wouldn't be the best person to do that.
What made the editor one that you wanted to adapt?
Again, I think it's as simple as it's less autobiographical. So the editor is a story about a young writer in early 1990s New York who gets his big break when Jacqueline Onassis buys his first book when she was an editor at Doubleday, which she had this incredible 15-year career as an editor after her second husband died, and edited more than 100 titles, and really prolific sort of third act to her life, which was so exciting. Part of it was that it's just less autobiographical. Part of it was, I don't need to tell you, that gay men love actresses. And so the writer's mother plays a big part in that book too. So there were two great roles for women who were, say, 60. And so the idea of being able to write for these women was sort of irresistible. I was up for that challenge.
And of course, I have to ask with Guncle, we talked early on here about the various permutations that Mame went through, from play to movie to musical movie. How many permutations would you like for the Guncle, and do you have a favorite one? Totally agnostic of what it may become. Would you want a Guncle musical at some point?
Oh my goodness. I miss theater and live performance so much. I miss it so much. And I would absolutely love to see a theatrical production, not a movie, but an on-stage production of any one of my books. Lily was something I thought could be, there was a wonderful adaptation of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which I believe won a couple Tony Awards for that. It was a brilliant production. Unlike, say, when I walked in the theater to see Jurassic Park, I think we have an acceptance of special effects now, and that we can really see anything on screen. But when you see something on stage with, interpreted in such a magical or inventive way, that's really where my heart still skips a beat, and there's nothing like it. So I would love to see one of my books on stage. The thing is now that since Patrick has a little, in the book, in the Guncle, he has a little riff on the Walt Disney Corporation, but I won't get into it here. But because of the Walt Disney Corporation having such success with their theatricals, Lion King and Aladdin and whatnot, it's not unfair to blame Disney. Like, look, Hairspray was a John Waters movie, and then a musical, and then a movie musical, and then a NBC Live production of the music. So, it's not just Disney, but you cannot sell film rights to a property anymore without them also acquiring the stage rights. So you're right. It'll have to go through all the stages before I see it, on an actual stage.
It'll be terrific if that happens. I'll keep my fingers crossed that it has a
me too. Yeah, I'll keep taking paycheck. Whenever I can collect another paycheck on something I've already done, that's a win-win. Yeah.
So it's June, it's Pride Month. Can you share to our listeners what Pride means to you?
I've been thinking about this a lot lately. So I just turned 50 like 2 weeks ago. And I know when I first came out in 1991, say early 1990s, more gay men were dying of AIDS in the early 90s than in the 80s. The death toll was, kind of at its highest. And that was a really scary time for me. It was before the internet, really, before cell phones, before ways to connect and to find community. I thought life would be lonely and sad and short. That was my fear. Having just turned 50 now and having such a rich community and being married, which is not something I ever thought I would see in my lifetime when I first came out. Life has been full of community. It has been full of joy. Not that there haven't been difficult moments, but full of joy. And it has been comparatively long to what I was afraid my life would be. So, pride to me is to honor those people we lost, because if I were 5 or 10, it's just a matter of circumstance. If I had been born 5 or 10 years earlier, I was one who left a small rural state and went to the big city and was desperate to find love and feel accepted. I don't know that I'd be here. So it's to honor those that are not still with us and to live life with an openness and honesty and a celebration that they would. People ask me, was it hard to turn 50 or something? I said, how many people would have traded anything to be able to live to 50? So that's part of it. But it's also because of AIDS, there wasn't a huge visible generation of mentors above me because we lost so many of them. And so it also means to be a mentor, hopefully, and to live as an example for younger people who are coming out today.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
That was a long-winded answer, but it's hopefully honest.
And an important one to put out there too.
Yeah.
From where things were as you were coming up to where we are now. I'm 52, so I'm kind of right there in that same space with you.
It's hard to remember how quickly things have changed. This is just happens to be in the headlines this week. The show Friends is having a reunion, and there's a lot of redressing of Friends now that, and it was problematic on queer issues. But I watched Friends at the time and I laughed and I thought it was funny. Instead of being angry at things from the past that feeling dated, we really need to honor the work of the people who made change happen so quickly, and celebrate the change I think that we have accomplished, because a lot has changed and the work continues. There are trans brothers and sisters are, things are hard for them and for queer people of color, and there's so much work still to do, but we've made a lot of progress and it's not time to take our foot off the gas.
Absolutely. As we prepare to wrap up here, Guncle, of course, just out, but is there anything else coming up next for you that we should be on the lookout for?
Well, hopefully I get one of these movies across the finish line. Yeah. And, I had a story just come out, an Audible original story narrated by Neil Patrick Harris called The Dogs of Venice, short story that I got to write during quarantine, which was, fun to be able to travel, at least in my writing. And hopefully it'll be fun to listen to and travel that way until we can all vacation again. So I have that. And then we'll see what I'll be able to talk about soon with the Guncle.
Fantastic. We love getting book recommendations from our guests. What's something you've read lately that you would recommend?
Well, so I've been looking at comedic novels. So I recently reread Less by Andrew Sean Greer, which I think is just obviously won the Pulitzer Prize. I think it's a masterpiece. To keep peace at home, I will say my husband is also a writer. Byron Lane wrote a very funny book that came out last summer called The Star is Bored, which was loosely based on his friendship with Carrie Fisher. Very, very funny novel. And there's a great novel called Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by a queer woman named Emily Austin. And it comes out in July. She's a debut writer, and it's very funny. It's wickedly funny, despite the title.
It's a hilarious sounding title, though.
Yeah.
What is the best way for everyone to keep up with you online for news of future projects?
Yeah, my website is always updated with events. I'm doing a bunch of virtual events for the book launch. And so links and everything are on my website, stevenrowley.com. And I am on Instagram and Twitter at Mr. Steven Rowley. And I love to connect with people there.
Fantastic. Well, Steven, it has been wonderful discussing this book with you. Best of success with it. And we'll link to everything in the show notes so people can find everything we talked about.
Oh, that's so great. So kind. It's been great to talk to you, and happy early Pride Month.